Hi everyone! So it is definitely that spooky time of year. Halloween is right around the corner, and while I could have done just a standard creepy spooky plant video for you, you guys know that I like to keep things a little bit more fun and a little bit more out of the box over here on my channel. So that's why today we are going to be answering the question, what if Disney villains were into plants? And since they are villains, I like to imagine that they are probably into evil, spooky, creepy looking plants. So yes, we are going to be looking at some rather disturbing, in some cases, plants today. But let me go ahead and get scooched over this way so I can put the villains and the plants up on screen for you over here, and we are just going to jump right into things. So the first villain that I want to take a look at today is Ursula from The Little Mermaid, and I kind of feel like if Ursula was into plants, Ursula would be into some plants that look a lot like sea life or aquatic in nature, such as this first kind of creepyish looking plant that is called an octopus stinkhorn. And this is actually a flower. And as you can see, very octopus tentacle-like in nature, which is why I think Ursula would totally be into this plant. However, she may not be into the smell of this plant because it is called a stinkhorn for a reason. Apparently it puts out a very, very foul odor. Now, another plant that I think she would be absolutely into is this Orbia caudata succulent plant, because these flowers that come in on this plant, to me, they look kind of like little starfish, and they're kind of like a little bit kind of creepy looking starfish with those kind of longer, thinner ends on them. But once again, I just feel like she would absolutely 100% be into this plant. And in addition to this plant, I feel like she would also be very into what is known as the brain cactus. Now, obviously called a brain cactus because it looks like a brain, but what else does it look like? Coral. Definitely looks like coral. And I'm just kind of imagining Ursula having this underwater little, plant collection of all these plants that kind of create this little sea life kind of vignette, if you will. But there's one other plant that I think that she would be into that's a little bit totally creepy in nature, and this is what is known as the mask flower plant. And as you can see, this center on this plant kind of has a little bit of a tentacle thing going on. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit of Cthulhu, if I'm being honest with you, which is definitely creepy. But once again, I just feel like she would be totally into all these plants. They would go so well together, and that would be what her little plant collection would look like. But the next villain I want to take a look at is actually Lady Tremaine from Cinderella. So this is Cinderella's evil stepmother. And there has been a meme going around related to houseplants and this lady. I think it's something along the lines of like, I always wanted to be a Disney princess when I grew up. Turns out I'm just this lady. And they photoshopped plants around her while she's laying in bed. But I like to think she'd be into some different types of plants than what is photoshopped in that meme. And one of the biggest ones that I came across that was kind of had that evil, creepy kind of vibe to it that just made me think of her right away is the black bearded iris. Now, this is a very fancy looking flower on this plant. It is very kind of prestigious looking, ruffled. It just kind of has a vibe that she has. She is very, wants to come across as super wealthy, super, hoity-toity, if you will. She does wear kind of the dresses and the style for that time period with the kind of ruffles and things, which is reminiscent of this plant and specifically the flowers that this plant produces. But as we all know, she is black-hearted, she is evil, she is mean, she has a black, dark soul, just like the coloring on this flower. So this is why I think that she would be very, very into the black bearded iris. Now, another Disney villain who I thought of when I looked at this plant as well is actually Captain Hook from Peter Pan. I mean, first of all, it's called a black bearded iris. Blackbeard was a pirate. Captain Hook was a pirate. This is kind of where my mind went with this. But once again, similar to her, he kind of has this like air of like, prestige. He wears the ruffles and everything like she does, but he is a villainous soul. And so once again, I feel like he would probably be into this plant as well. But the next Disney villain I want to look at is one of the OG Disney villains, and that is the evil queen from Snow White. And honestly, I was having a hard time kind of deciding what kind of plant I thought she would be in until I came across this plant. This is called the bleeding heart plant. Called that because I believe these are actually berries that this plant produces. If I'm not right about that, I'll flash what they actually are up on screen for you. But as you can see, they are heart-shaped, and then they have what looks like dripping blood coming off of the bottom of them. And since we know the evil queen was out for blood, and specifically she wanted Snow White's heart, the second I saw this plant, I was like, that's the one. The evil queen would be totally into this plant. But I also think that the next Disney villain I want to talk about would be into this plant as well, and that is the Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. First of all, she's the Queen of Hearts. This plant is a bleeding heart plant that produces these berries that look like hearts. We know she was all about everything red. So yeah, I feel like she would definitely be into this plant. But for some reason, I came across this kind of weird, unique, dark, spooky kind of looking begonia that was also just kind of like a little bit whimsical. And so I really looked at this and thought, I feel like the Queen of Hearts would be into this too. It kind of goes with that whole quirky Alice in Wonderland theme, but it is very much still, I feel like, in her style, because we know everything she's into is like white, black, and red. Everything she wears, all of the playing cards that are going on in there, and I just feel like these are two very interesting, unique, slightly creepy, but still, like I said, a little bit whimsical plants that she would definitely be into. But next up, let's take a look at a villain from more recent history, and that is Dr. Facilier from The Princess and the Frog. Now, we know he is a witch doctor, we know he is into voodoo, and immediately plants started popping into my brain that I thought he would be into, and the first one, of course, was mandrake. And if you are not familiar, mandrake, when you pull it out of the ground, its roots and everything make it look like a person, basically. It looks like a human, and in certain ways it looks kind of like a voodoo doll to me. So that was the first one where I was like, man, he would have mandrake on hand. He'd probably be using it in some kind of spells and all kinds of other things. But there are some other plants that I thought of when I thought of Dr. Facilier as well. And keeping along those lines of voodoo dolls and just dolls in general, there is this plant which is called doll's eyes. And as you can see, it produces these white berries that have this black dot on them that make them look like eyes. It's totally creepy. Super duper creepy, but I feel like he would dig this plant. He would probably have it on hand once again to cast some spells and whatnot. And then there is this last plant, which I believe this is called Dracula Simia. If it's not, I'll flash it up on screen for you. I think I've also heard it referred to as the Darth Vader plant before, but as you can see, it kind of produces these flowers that when they die off, leave behind what looks like a little miniature skull, like a little miniature skull head thing. And once again, just totally gives me like witch doctor voodoo vibes. I do believe Dr. Facilier even has like the skull on his hat, the skull and crossbones type situation on his hat. So I definitely feel like he would be heavily into this plant. But this next villain I want to bring up, this one might be a little bit obscure for people, especially depending on your age, because we got to go pretty far back for this villain. And this is from a movie called The Black Cauldron, and this is the Horned King. He was the primary villain in that Disney movie. And as you can see, very skeletal looking. I kind of feel like he would be into that last plant we looked at as well. But I also immediately thought of this horned begonia, and I will have to flash up on screen for you what the exact name of this begonia is because it just evaded my brain completely. But I've been seeing this one pop up a lot lately, especially because we are in that spooky season and it is rather creepy looking. I'm gonna be honest, like I don't know that I would ever want to own this begonia, but I feel like the Horned King would totally be into this. I mean, he's got the horns, this plant's got all those little spikes going on there. It looks like you could probably hurt somebody with it. And so yeah, I kind of feel like he would really be digging on this plant. But next up, I want to take a look at Jafar from Aladdin, one of my favorite movies. And if you don't recall, Jafar is always walking around with his little cobra walking stick magical thing. And at one point in the movie, we have this thing come to life and the cobra is trying to like eat everybody and everything. So immediately when I was thinking about the type of plants that he would be into, this plant popped into my brain. This is what is known as a California pitcher plant. This is a carnivorous plant, so it does like to eat things. And as you can see, it's kind of shaped a little bit like a cobra. So of course I was like, duh, Jafar would totally dig this plant. And this plant actually can get pretty tall. Now, you guys might be hearing pitcher plant and thinking about the ones where it's a little pitcher that kind of hangs off of a vine hanging type plant situation. This is a little different. This one just grows straight up and it can get 3 to 5 feet tall. So, you know, it could actually really look like snakes at that size. So definitely feel like this would be Jafar's like #1 go-to I'm in love with plant. But next up, let's take a look at Maleficent from Sleeping Beauty. And there were a couple of plants that immediately I thought of because, well, let's just be honest. Let's look at this. I believe this is called the King Kong coleus plant. And I mean, it's just her colors. It's her colors. It's like all her favorite colors that combine make her extra creepy. And yeah, the plant is very dark in nature. It's very kind of brooding, just like she is. So I 100% feel like this would be her top choice if she were into plants. However, I also feel like she would be very into this next plant, which is called the purple devil plant. And the reason I feel like she would be into this plant, not only, once again, does it involve purple, which seems to be one of her favorite colors with a little bit of yellow, but this plant produces these totally scary looking big thorns. And as we all know, she tried to prevent the prince from going and waking up Sleeping Beauty by bringing to life all of those thorn bushes around the castle to try and attack him and stop him. So 100% certain she would be into this plant. But next up we have Hades from the movie Hercules. And honestly, you guys, I feel like he'd probably be into any and all of these plants that I'm showing you today because, you know, he's the ruler of the underworld. I feel like he's into just evil, creepy, you know, scary things. So he'd probably like all these plants. But there are two plants in particular that I think he would be extra into. And the first one is called a ghost plant. Now, this is actually a type of fungi that actually feeds and survives off of other types of fungi. So it is a parasitic type plant, but it has this ghostly look to it. It is almost kind of has a glowing like quality to it, which reminds me a little bit of Hades' glowing hair. So I really think he would be super into this plant. I also think he would probably be very into what is known as devil's claw. And this, as you can see, kind of creepy, dark looking plant here, but if you recall, and you know, I might be remembering it just extra like over the top from what it actually was, but I really remember his fingers being very long and thin compared to the rest of him in that movie. And so I kind of feel like he has devil's claws for hands. And so I just felt like this plant would be something he is really into. And it kind of just made me think about his long, crazy, thin fingers, but totally creepy looking plant. But this next plant I want to show you guys, I don't know why. This one's a little bit more of an obscure like reference because I don't know, I just saw it and it made me think of this Disney villain. And this is actually one of my all-time favorite Disney movies, even to this day, and that is The Emperor's New Groove. So of course we are talking about Yzma. And if you guys will recall, she wears this like over-the-top like cape thing when she's kind of pretending to do the emperor's job. And so when I saw this next plant I'm about to show you, I immediately thought of that. And then when I read more about this plant, I was like, I had to assign it to her because they also make fun in that movie about the fact that she looks like the Walking Dead and like joking about how old is she. And so this plant is what is known as the corpse flower. And so as you can see here, this big like kind of ruffled situation going on around there, and once again it matches the color scheme for her. It just immediately made me think of that cape, and then the fact that it's called the corpse flower made me think about the fact that they kind of joke about her looking like the Walking Dead. However, once again, I'm not sure she would be too thrilled with the smell that this plant produces because it does, when it blooms, put out a horrible odor for, I believe I read, up to like 12 hours or something. But beyond that, I just feel like this plant is very over the top like she is, and something that she would definitely be into if she was into plants. Now for our next villain, we're gonna have to go quite a ways back in time once again to the movie The Sword in the Stone. And our villain from that movie that we're taking a look at today is Madame Mim. And for those of you who perhaps have not seen the movie or don't remember, she is a witch. She is kind of Merlin's rival in that movie. And so she lives in this kind of, you know, witchy type house with all of these weird witchy type things, which makes me think she would be into bizarro witchy type plants, including this first plant, which, by the way, you guys, this is like easily the grossest looking plant that we're looking at today. And it is what is called the bleeding tooth plant. And I mean, look at how gross this thing is. I mean, it's disgusting looking, for real. It's actually a type of fungus, and like a lot of the other plants that we're looking at on this evil and creepy list, which, I mean, all these things that these plants do is kind of like evil and creepy when you think about it too, because a lot of them, like this one, feed off of other plants. So they're very destructive. This one actually likes to feed off the roots of trees, and these red, like dripping, bloody looking things going on here is actually how it releases its spores to reproduce. But absolutely disgusting, but definitely looks like something a witch would be into and have on hand for any kind of potion she might be making. I also feel like this next plant might be something she has lying around with her creepy witchy stuff. And this I've seen labeled as just straight up evil plant. I've also seen it labeled as jackal's food, and I will flash the scientific name up on screen for you. But this plant is bizarre. It is evil looking. It kind of reminds me of the plant from the Little Shop of Horrors. Like, I'm kind of wondering if maybe it wasn't loosely based on this plant. But this plant, first of all, what you're actually seeing here is the flower of this plant. So this plant actually lives mostly underground, but when it needs to reproduce, it sends up these hideous, totally scary looking flowers. And so as you can see, it looks like it has teeth. Super creepy, looks like it's a mouth opening, extra creepy, has this weird kind of leathery texture look to it. I don't know, it's bizarre, but I feel like it's something she would be into because she was a very unique, bizarre villain. But I have saved my favorite creepy, evil looking plant for last today, and when I saw this plant and I was thinking about doing this video, there was one villain that popped into my brain, and once again, this might be a slightly more obscure reference, but for those of you that remember the movie Oliver and Company, there was a primary villain, but he had a henchman, a primary henchman, and that henchman's name was Fidget, and Fidget was a bat. And if ever there was going to be a Disney villain that would be into this plant I'm about to show you, it would be Fidget, because take a look at this. This is what is known as the bat flower, and as you can see, it looks a little bit like an evil, slightly crazy, slightly psycho bat. And if ever there was an evil, slightly crazy, slightly psycho bat who was a villain in a Disney movie, it would be Fidget. So hands down, we know this would be Fidget's favorite plant if he were into plants. But I hope you guys have enjoyed coming along on this little fun adventure with me today of looking at spooky, creepy, evil plants and which Disney villains might be into them. If so, please be sure to click that like and or subscribe button down below. And I hope you all have a spooky, fun, and safe Halloween. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. Aloha!